The wind didn't just howl over the open plains, it screamed. It was a raw, hungry sound, the kind that rips the soul right out of you. It tore through the woman's threadbare shawl like a predator's claws, and she clutched her newborn baby tighter, so tight she could feel his tiny, fragile ribs against her own. She pressed his face into her chest, a desperate, futile shield against the bitter cold that was already seeping into their bones. They had taken her boots. The very people she once called her neighbors, her community, had stripped the leather from her feet and left her to the wilderness. Now, her bare skin sank into the icy mud with every single step, a fresh agony that shot up her legs. The baby whimpered, a small bird-like cry that the storm almost swallowed whole. Overhead, black crows circled like patient undertakers, their dark wings stark against the bruised purple sky. They knew what was coming. She stumbled once, her ankle twisting on a frozen rock. Then again, her knees buckling from exhaustion. Finally, she fell hard, a dead weight collapsing onto the frozen ground beside the ghost of a dying fire. The last light of day was bleeding out across the horizon, a deep, bloody gash in the clouds, and with it, her last flicker of hope. No one was coming for her. She knew that with a certainty that was colder than the ice forming on her hair. She had been cast out, judged, and abandoned to the elements like a piece of trash. In the distance, just beyond a low rise, a dark silhouette on horseback watched her. The figure was silent, perfectly still, a statue carved from the coming night. The woman didn't see him. She was too weak to lift her head, too numb to feel the snow that was already starting to fall, blanketing her and her child in a soft, white shroud. She whispered a prayer into the baby's ear, a trembling promise she knew, in her heart, she could not possibly keep. As the shadows of night crept in to claim them, she shut her eyes, surrendering to the bitter, final silence of the cold. But fate, it turns out, wasn't finished with her yet. And the man on the horse? He wasn't who she thought he was. He wasn't who anyone thought he was. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something. A huge number of people who listen to these stories never subscribe. It's a fact. If even a small part of today's story touches your heart or gets your pulse racing, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's completely free for you, but for me, it means I can keep bringing you stories just like this one. It means the world. Now, let's get back to it. There were towns on the frontier where life was hard, but people had a core of decency. And then there was Ash Hollow. Ash Hollow wore its cruelty like a second skin. It wasn't just a place on a map, it was a sickness of the soul. Dust, fine as ground bone, rolled down its single rutted street like tired ghosts searching for a place to rest and finding none. The wooden storefronts sagged, their porches leaning like old men with broken backs, as if even the buildings themselves had given up all hope. The sky, when it wasn't choked with that relentless dust, stretched on forever in a shade of cold, empty blue that offered no comfort at all. It was here that a woman named Mara Langley had tried to build a life, and it was here that she was being slowly, deliberately crushed under the weight of something far heavier than poverty. She was being crushed by whispered hatred, a poison that had infected every well and every heart in that miserable town. No one had welcomed her when she first arrived. She was a young widow with a heavy, pronounced limp and a secret buried so deep in her eyes it was like looking down a well. She'd stepped off the dusty stagecoach, carrying little more than a battered suitcase that had seen better days, and a worn gold wedding band that still clung to her finger like a memory. She found a home, if you could call it that, in the abandoned shack on the very edge of town, near the crooked fence where the buffalo no longer roamed, a place everyone else had forgotten. At first, the town simply tolerated her. She was quiet, kept to herself, and earned a few meager coins by sewing torn shirts and washing dusty linens for the townsfolk. Her head was always bowed low, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if she was afraid to meet anyone's gaze. But it didn't take long for the whispers to start. They grew like weeds in the cracked earth. "That one. She brings bad luck," the women would mutter outside the general store, their eyes flicking towards her, pretending not to stare, but staring all the same. "Her husband died right after they married," another would add, her voice a little louder, a little crueler. "Says all you need to know, don't it?" It wasn't just the limp that marked Mara as different, that set her apart in their small, suspicious minds. It was the deep, jagged scar that ran along the line of her jaw, a pale, puckered line that disappeared into her hairline. It was a harsh, permanent reminder of a night no one in town dared ask about, a night she never, ever spoke of. Some said it was from an Indian raid out on the plains. Others whispered she'd been cursed by a witch, that the mark was a sign of a dark pact. The truth was, no one really knew. And what was worse, no one cared enough to find out. The real story was always less interesting than the hateful fiction they could create. The children of Ash Hollow, learning their cruelty from their parents, gave her a wide berth. They'd run to the other side of the street when she approached, and when the adults weren't looking, they'd toss small stones at her shadow, laughing as she flinched. The preacher's wife, a woman who spoke of God's love every Sunday, once crossed herself dramatically, just passing Mara in the dusty street, as if protecting herself from some unseen evil. The blacksmith's boy, a lanky youth with mean eyes, spat on the ground right at her feet. Mara endured it all in a crushing, suffocating silence. What was the point in speaking up? Who would listen? No one would give the time of day to a woman who spoke with a slight slur, the result of an old injury to her mouth that made her words sound thick and strange to their ears. And even if she had found the strength to scream her innocence, to shout her pain into the open, the bitter winds of Ash Hollow would have just carried her pleas away like smoke from a chimney, lost in the vast, uncaring emptiness. So Mara learned to live in the spaces where no one else looked, in the empty pews at the very back of the church, a place reserved for sinners and outcasts, in the last row of the market, where the bruised and rotting apples were left for the flies. She lived in the dim, dusty light of her tiny home, where the floorboards creaked out a lonely song that only she and her unborn child could hear, because that was the secret she was hiding, the secret that was about to turn their whispers into a roar. Mara was carrying a child. The moment her condition became visible, the moment the slight swell of her belly could no longer be hidden by her worn dress, the rumors multiplied like rats in a grain store. "No husband, no morals," they whispered behind their hands, their eyes glinting with self-righteous glee. "Serves the woman right." "Carrying a bastard," they sneered in the saloon, the men laughing over their cheap whiskey. "A stain on this town." None of them knew the truth, of course. They couldn't imagine the nights she cried herself to sleep, clutching a worn, faded scrap of her dead husband's old shirt, the last piece of him she had left. They didn't know about the promises they had whispered to each other under a blanket of dying stars, or the way she spoke to the growing life inside her belly, telling the baby stories of his father, telling him he was the last flicker of light left in a world that had gone dark. In Ash Hollow, kindness was a rationed commodity, and there was none to spare for a woman with the name Mara Langley. The baby came on a bitter, freezing night, long before the spring thaw had any chance of breaking winter's grip. She was all alone, with nothing but a dull knife she'd sharpened on a stone and a single frayed blanket. Mara fought and bled and wept until her son, small and impossibly perfect, entered the world with a thin, quivering cry that cut through the silence of her shack. She named him Eli, after her husband, the man they had all forgotten. She wrapped him in the only clean blanket she owned and pressed him against her heart, feeling the warmth of his tiny body against her skin. For one fleeting, beautiful moment, it was just the two of them against the entire world. And in that moment, that was enough. Until it wasn't. The very next morning, the town council met. They didn't invite her. The meeting was held behind the closed doors of the sheriff's office, but Mara had seen them from her window, a group of grim-faced men looking at her shack with something sharper and more dangerous than simple disdain. She saw something that looked like fear. A burden, they called her. A stain, they said. A bad omen that needed to be cleansed. That night, they came for her. They didn't shout. They didn't curse her name. Their silence was far more terrifying. They simply kicked in her door, a dark tide of shadows flooding her small home. A rough hand was clamped over her mouth to stifle her screams, and they dragged her from her bed, from her home, from the only place she had in the world. She clutched her newborn baby, Eli, desperately to her chest, her only thought to protect him. They dragged her out past the edge of town, past the last flickering lantern, and left her on the plains, the place where the wind screamed loud enough to swallow a mother's cries whole, a broken woman, a newborn child, and not a soul to call for help. The stars above were like chips of ice, cold and uncaring, glittering over a land that had never once promised mercy. And as they walked away, leaving her to freeze, the last thing Mara saw before the darkness started to take her was the shadow of that rider on the horizon. A lone, still figure, just watching, waiting. But what the town of Ash Hollow didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the rider wasn't a threat. He was the only hope she had left. If this story is already breaking your heart, you haven't seen the worst of it yet. Not even close. Tap that subscribe button. Because I've got another truth waiting for you, and you won't want to miss it. At first, Mara thought the rider was a trick of the dying light, a figment of her freezing, exhausted mind. A shadow, nothing more, shifting between the skeletal, grasping trees as the snow began to hiss against his horse's legs. But then he moved closer, out of the twilight and into the pale, ghostly glow of the moon. She saw the gleam of his dark hair beneath a wide, fur-lined hood, and the unmistakable shape of a spear strapped across his back. A Sioux warrior. A fresh wave of fear, colder than the wind, rippled through her. Every terrible story the townsfolk had ever whispered about savages and raids rose like bile in her throat. Her grip tightened on Eli, a purely instinctive gesture, even though her arms were so numb with cold she could barely feel him. The warrior dismounted slowly, deliberately, his movements measured and calm. His moccasins were completely silent in the freshly fallen snow. He stood a good distance away from her, maybe 20 paces, and held his hands out, empty and open, to show he meant no harm. His breath misted in the frozen air, a small cloud of life in the vast, deadening cold. Mara couldn't run. She could barely even sit upright. All the strength had been leached from her body. All she could do was stare at him, this towering, imposing figure wrapped in leather and furs, with eyes like storm clouds, deep, dark, and utterly unreadable. A long, tense moment passed between them. No words were spoken. The only sound was the sharp, broken breathing of the wind and the faint, whimpering cries of her baby. Then, without a sound, the man reached into a satchel at his side. Mara flinched, expecting a weapon, but he withdrew a thick, heavy blanket, woven with rich, dark reds and earthy tones. He knelt slowly, as if he were approaching a wounded, terrified animal, and placed the blanket on the snow a few feet away from her. No sudden movements, no demands, just a simple, silent offering. Mara's lips parted. They were dry and cracked, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to beg him not to leave her and her baby to die. But no sound came out. Her throat was a raw, useless knot. Instead, she watched, mesmerized, as he built a fire. His hands moved with an expert grace she had never seen before. He struck flint against steel, catching a spark in a small bundle of dry tinder, and stacked pieces of wood with a practiced, efficient speed. Within minutes, A small, hopeful blaze crackled to life between them, sending up a thin thread of blessed, life-giving heat into the icy night. He never tried to touch her. He never tried to take the baby. He simply sat down across the fire from her, cross-legged, his back straight, watching her in silence. The firelight caught on a pendant carved from bone that hung around his neck. It was a hawk, its wings spread in full flight. Mara stared at him, at the fine lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, at the quiet, unshakable strength in his posture. There was no pity in his gaze. There was no disgust. There was only a deep, profound patience. It was a kind of patience she hadn't seen since her husband's death, a kind of listening that didn't require any words. Her vision blurred with tears she hadn't known she still had left to cry. The warmth of the fire was beginning to thaw the ice in her veins, and with it, the ice around her heart. The warrior finally spoke. His voice was low and even, a stark contrast to the screaming wind. "Cold," he said simply, nodding toward the baby still clutched in her arms. Startled by the sound, Mara looked down at Eli. His tiny lips were turning a frightening dusky shade of blue. With shaking, clumsy hands, she dragged herself closer to the fire, pulling the offered blanket around both of them, clutching Eli to her chest as if she could force her own life force into him. The man watched, but he didn't interfere. Not once. Night fell completely, wrapping the world in an absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light was their small, defiant fire, which cast long, dancing shadows that twitched and leaped like spirits in the trees around them. The warrior spoke no more words that night. Neither did Mara. But something passed between them in that silence. Something older and more enduring than language. A silent understanding. An unspoken promise. By morning, the storm had passed. The world was blanketed in a pristine, silent white. Mara, to her own surprise, was able to sit up properly. The fire, which the warrior had tended all through the night while she drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, had kept them alive. The Sioux warrior, who had kept a silent, unwavering vigil, stood up when he saw she was awake. He approached her slowly and placed a small bundle at her feet. Inside was dried meat, a skin filled with fresh water, and a thin-bladed practical knife. When Mara lifted her gaze to meet his, a single burning question was trembling on her lips. Why? Why was he doing this? Why save a woman the world had thrown away? But she couldn't ask it. The words wouldn't form. He didn't need her to ask. He seemed to understand anyway. Instead of answering the unspoken question, he tapped his own chest lightly with his fingertips. "Catan," he said. His name. Then he pointed at her in return, his gaze patient, waiting. "Mara," she whispered, her voice hoarse and raw from disuse. Catan nodded once, a solemn, respectful acknowledgement. Then he gestured toward the horizon, to the distant snow-covered hills that rose up like sleeping beasts. It was a silent offer, a clear choice. Come with me. Survive. Behind her, in the direction she had come from, the town of Ash Hollow loomed like a ghost in the distance. Even from here, she could see the thin plumes of smoke rising from its chimneys. Tiny figures, like ants, were already moving along the road, likely preparing for Sunday service, ready to thank their God for their own piety while she froze to death. They would not want her back. They had made that brutally clear. They never had. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that if she left now, if she rode off with a Sioux warrior, they would brand her something far worse than an outcast. They would call her a traitor, a turncoat, worse. If they ever found her again, there would be no banishment. There would be a rope. Still, what life could she offer Eli here, on the frozen plains? What future could he possibly have among people who already hated the very sight of him before he had even drawn his second breath? She looked at Catan, at the gentle, respectful way he waited, offering her a choice without pressure, without force. He was giving her back a piece of her own will, something the town had tried to strip from her completely. Mara tightened her grip on her baby. Her heart hammered a painful, frantic rhythm against her ribs. The choice was terrifying, but it was also the only choice she had. It was already made. She nodded, just once. A flicker of something, relief, a smile, touched Catan's mouth. He turned without a word and began leading the way, his horse following behind him toward the safety of the hills. But even as Mara disappeared over the horizon, a new and more venomous suspicion was festering back in Ash Hollow. A group of men, the same men who had dragged her from her home, gathered in the smoky tavern, their rough hands wrapped around glasses of whiskey, their mouths twisted in cruel, angry lines. "She ain't dead," the sheriff, a man named Crowley with a face like a clenched fist, growled. He slammed his glass down on the bar, sloshing liquor onto the scarred wood. "I'll bet my best horse on it." "And now she's gone and run off with a redskin," one of the ranchers sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot stove. "They'll be breeding half-bloods before the winter's through." A dark, ugly anger brewed in their hearts, black and thick as tar. Mara hadn't just broken their silent, unwritten rules by surviving their judgment. She had humiliated them. She had defied their power. And men like that didn't forgive. They didn't forget. They hunted. The game had just changed. It was no longer about casting out a sinner. It was about burying a secret they would kill to protect. The sun barely managed to cut through the thick gray clouds that hung low over the world. Snow drifted lazily down from the colorless sky, frosting the landscape in a muffled, endless white. Every step Mara took felt heavier than the last, a monumental effort of will. She followed Catan through the winding, treacherous hills, her son Eli bundled and warm against her chest, her own worn boots slipping and sliding on the frozen, unforgiving ground. The world was utterly silent, except for the rhythmic crunch of their steps in the snow and the occasional lonely call of a crow from the high branches overhead. It should have been peaceful, this pristine, untouched wilderness. But peace doesn't settle easily on the soul of someone who has been hunted. Somewhere behind them, the malevolent spirit of Ash Hollow still stirred. They were days away now, tucked deep into the forested folds of the landscape where few white men ever dared to wander. But evil has a long reach, and an even longer memory. When the trap was finally sprung, it wasn't a battle. It was a betrayal, sharp and unexpected. A man's voice, rough and chillingly familiar, stopped her dead in her tracks. "Well, well, look what the storm blew back in." Mara froze, and her blood ran instantly cold. Jonah Reeves stepped out from behind a thick clump of pine trees, a rifle resting lazily on his shoulder, a wolfish, predatory grin spreading across his scarred face. Two other men fanned out to flank him, Tommy Greaves and Samuel Hill. Local boys from Ash Hollow, their faces full of the same stupid, cruel pride she remembered. They were vigilantes now, itching for an excuse to spill blood, to prove their own righteousness. Their heavy boots crushed the new snow as they moved closer, their formation deliberate, surrounding her. Mara instinctively clutched Eli tighter, turning her body to shield him. Catan was gone. He was out of sight, hunting for them a few ridges over. He'd told her to wait here. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. "You think you can just run off with one of them?" Jonah sneered, spitting a wad of tobacco into the pure white snow. It left a disgusting brown stain. "After all the good Christian folk of Ash Hollow tried to do for you." Tears of rage and fear burned at the back of Mara's eyes, but she forced herself to stand taller. She would not cry for them. She would not give them that satisfaction. "You're a stain, Mara," Tommy jeered, his voice high and nervous. "A stain on a decent town. Better we just clean it up for good." Before Mara could even turn to run, Samuel Hill lunged. With a vicious grunt, he wrenched Eli from her arms. The scream that tore from Mara's throat was not human. It was the raw, instinctive cry of a mother animal whose young has been stolen. She staggered forward, her hands outstretched, reaching blindly for her baby. That's when Jonah swung the butt of his rifle. He didn't hesitate. The heavy wood slammed into her stomach, and a universe of pain exploded through her. She crumpled into the snow, the air driven from her lungs, gasping, clutching her side as black spots danced in her vision. Samuel laughed, a high, cruel sound. He began tossing Eli roughly from one hand to the other, a grotesque mockery of a game, ignoring the child's terrified, piercing cries. The sound, the sharp, panicked wail of her son, broke something inside Mara that had already been cracked beyond repair. She tried to crawl toward him, her fingers digging into the snow, dragging her useless body forward. But Jonah simply placed a heavy boot on her back and pressed down hard, grinding her face into the frozen earth. "You don't deserve this, little brat," he growled, his voice low and full of a venom that went beyond simple prejudice. "Should have died with your husband." The name of her husband, on this man's lips, sent a new shock through her. Mara's vision blurred from the pain and the helpless, boiling rage. This wasn't about her being an outcast. This was something else. Something personal. Above them, a crow screamed from a high branch, a sharp, angry cry. Catan heard it, and he saw the scene from the ridge above. He moved like a ghost through the trees, silent, swift, and lethal, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. But Mara didn't see him coming. All she knew was this. One moment, Samuel was laughing, Eli held aloft in his hands. The next, Samuel's hands were suddenly, shockingly empty. Eli tumbled downwards, but not to the ground. He fell into a waiting, outstretched blanket. There was a blur of movement, a hard shove, a sharp cry of pain, and Samuel went sprawling backwards into the snow, clutching a wrist that was now bent at an unnatural angle. Jonah, stunned for a second, recovered and raised his rifle. But Catan was faster. The heavy butt of Catan's spear slammed into the side of Jonah's temple with a sickening thud, and he dropped like a sack of grain, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Tommy Greaves, the last one standing, took one look at the silent, deadly warrior and the two men on the ground, and he ran. He scrambled back through the trees, slipping and falling in his panic. He didn't get far. Catan didn't kill them. He didn't have to. For men like these, defeat was its own kind of poison. Their humiliation would be a deeper wound than any blade could inflict. Catan scooped up Eli from the blanket, his movements careful and gentle, as if he were handling something sacred. He knelt beside Mara in the snow. She was curled into a tight ball, shivering violently, a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of her mouth where her teeth had cut her lip. He placed the baby gently back into her arms. Mara clung to Eli, rocking him back and forth, her body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. Catan didn't speak. He just sat beside her on the cold ground, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to block the worst of the biting wind. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He didn't force her to rise. He simply stayed. He waited, as long as she needed. Later, when the violent shaking finally stopped and her breathing began to even out, Mara slowly lifted her head. Catan met her gaze. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no shame for her weakness. There was only a quiet, profound understanding. Slowly, wordlessly, he held out his hand to her. It wasn't a gesture of pulling her up. It wasn't an offer to carry her. It was an invitation. Walk with me, as an equal. Mara looked at his strong, calloused hand for a long time. She thought of all the times no one had stayed. No one had waited. No one had truly seen her. The people of Ash Hollow had seen her scars, her silence, her limp, and they had seen a victim, a curse. Catan saw her. With a hand that still trembled slightly, Mara reached out and took his. They thought she was broken. They thought she was just ashes. But they were wrong. Someone was here, seeing the gold that lay hidden underneath. The forest closed in around them like the walls of a cathedral, the heavy branches laden with new snow, muffling the world in a sacred silence. Each step forward was a battle against the deep, throbbing pain in her side and the fresh, raw memory of the assault. But Mara held Eli close, so close, and felt Catan's steady, reassuring presence just beside her. Not leading, not dragging, just there. And somehow, in that endless, silent, white landscape, Mara came to a startling realization. She was not as alone as the world had tried so hard to make her believe. She still bled, yes. She was still wounded. But she had not been conquered. Not yet. Not ever. Before we dive into the next part of this incredible story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, and I'm the voice you're hearing right now. If you're enjoying the narration, the way it sounds, let me know in the comments. Your feedback helps us decide if we should keep the same voice for future videos. Thanks, and let's get back to Mara. The winter began to ease its vicious grip on the land, one stubborn, melting degree at a time. The ice that had choked the creek banks began to crack and break apart. The brittle, frozen trees began to whisper in the wind again, not groan under its weight. With each passing day, Mara found she could walk a little farther. Her limp was still pronounced, a permanent reminder of her past, but her spine was a little straighter, her gaze a little higher. Catan stayed close, but he never smothered her. His presence was a quiet strength, a silent support that gave her the space she needed to heal on her own terms. Some days they spoke, piecing together a conversation in his sparse English and her hesitant gestures. Other days, they worked in a comfortable, shared silence. It didn't matter. They were building something. Not just a shelter, but a life. It started small. A simple lean-to, built from sturdy pine branches and the animal skins Catan had cured, tucked securely into the crook of two large hills that protected it from the wind. Mara took on the task of building a hearth. She gathered stones from the creek bed, her fingers numb and clumsy at first from the cold and disuse, but growing more sure, more capable with each stone she placed. Catan worked by her side, not doing it for her, but showing her with quiet gestures when words failed. He showed her which stones were flat enough, which ones would hold the heat best. When she finally managed to stack the stones into a rough, sturdy, proud ring, she sat back in the snow, exhausted but filled with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. A wide, genuine grin spread across her face. Catan looked at the hearth, then at her, and nodded once. A solemn but deeply pleased acknowledgement of her work. They lit the first fire in their new home together. It crackled and popped, a cheerful living sound in the vast wilderness. It threw a golden, dancing light against the snow, painting their faces in flickering warmth. Mara wrapped Eli in a thick, woven cloth Catan had given her and sat near the flames, just staring at the way they danced, a hypnotic, beautiful ballet of orange and yellow. For the first time in months, maybe even years, she didn't feel like an intruder in her own life. She wasn't an outcast hiding in someone else's abandoned shack. She belonged here. Not because someone had given her permission to exist, but because she had chosen it. She had built it with her own two hands. But even in the vast, remote wilds, the world's cruelties have a way of finding the cracks. One morning, as Catan was outside mending one of the lodge poles, Mara heard the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding up the hidden trail to their camp. Her body reacted before her mind could. She ducked instinctively, clutching Eli close to her chest, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. Catan's hand flew to the hilt of the long knife at his belt, his body going still and alert. A rider burst into view, his horse panting, sides heaving. It wasn't a soldier. It was something almost worse. It was Sheriff Amos Crowley, the man who was the law back in Ash Hollow. a man who seemed more comfortable stringing up outcasts than protecting the innocent. He sat atop a massive black gelding, his small, pig-like eyes squinting under the brim of his stained, dusty hat. He surveyed their small, hard-won camp with a contemptuous sneer. "Well now, ain't this a cozy little nest?" he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm and menace. Mara felt her stomach turn to a cold, hard knot. She knew that look. It was the same one the townsfolk wore right before they turned vicious, the look that said you don't belong. "You're harboring a fugitive," Crowley said, his voice dropping, becoming harder. He jerked his chin toward Catan. "That redskin is wanted for the assault on Jonah Reeves and his men." It was a lie, a twisted version of the truth, but it was a lie with the weight of a badge behind it. Catan didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just watched the sheriff, his expression unreadable. Mara, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed, stood up too. She held Eli tighter, the warmth of the fire crackling at her back like a protective heartbeat. "He didn't do anything but save my life," she said. Her voice was small against the vastness of the wilderness, but it was steady, unwavering. Crowley's smirk returned. "That ain't for you to decide, girl. The law's the law, and you'll be coming back with me. The town council has some questions for you." Catan took a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't draw his knife. He didn't make a threat. He simply moved to stand between Mara and the sheriff, his shoulders square, his body a solid, immovable wall. Crowley's eyes narrowed and his hand twitched, drifting down toward the butt of the pistol holstered on his hip. But something in Catan's stance, something in the absolute lack of fear in his eyes, made him hesitate. This wasn't some scared farmer he could bully. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous. "I ain't asking," Crowley said, trying to regain his authority, spitting into the dirt near Catan's feet. Catan said nothing. His silence was more powerful than any threat. Only the wind answered, whispering through the pines. The moments stretched out, thick with tension, feeling like lifetimes. Finally, with a muttered curse, Crowley yanked hard on his horse's reins, turning the big animal around in the small clearing. "You'll regret this," he growled over his shoulder, his voice full of impotent fury. "Both of you. Mark my words." The sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded back down the trail, swallowed by the trees. Mara let out a long, shaking breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. She looked at Catan, who was still watching the trail where the sheriff had disappeared. He turned and met her gaze with that same calm, grounded strength. He wasn't her savior. He wasn't her owner. He was her partner. Together, they turned back to their home. Their fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The seasons shifted, turning the world from white to green. Spring brought rivers of rushing meltwater roaring through the valleys. Summer followed, spreading a riot of wildflowers like a painted blanket across the hills. Mara and Catan worked side by side, day in and day out. They built more walls for their lodge, wove stronger roofs from reeds and grasses. They even tended a small herd of hardy mountain ponies Catan had managed to trade for from a trapper passing through the territory. Mara learned to ride again. She was clumsy at first, her body still remembering old pains, but soon she found her balance, her confidence growing with every ride through the high meadows. Eli took his first wobbly steps on the soft earth of their clearing, chasing after the new spring colts, his delighted laughter rising like music through the pines. They weren't rich. They certainly weren't safe, not with the shadow of Ash Hollow still hanging over them. But they were truly, deeply alive. One night, under the golden light of a fat harvest moon, Catan stoked the fire high. He reached into the small leather pouch he always wore at his belt and pulled something out. It was a simple leather thong, but threaded onto it were tiny, hand-carved beads of wood and bone, and one single bright red hawk's feather. He offered it to Mara, not with a grand ceremony, but with a shy, almost boyish tilt of his head that she had come to adore. Mara's throat tightened. She understood the gesture instantly. This wasn't a gold ring. It wasn't a vow spoken before a preacher and a crowd of witnesses. This was something older, something truer. A promise carved not in stone, but in bone and spirit. She reached out with fingers that trembled slightly and accepted the gift. She tied the leather thong around her own wrist, the red feather a startling slash of color against her skin. Their eyes met across the flickering firelight. No words were spoken. None were needed. The fire between them burned just as steady, just as sure as the one in their hearth. But peace is always a fragile thing, and pasts are heavy things to carry. They never truly leave you. One evening, as Mara was down at the creek fetching water for their meal, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't Sheriff Crowley this time. It was a woman, and the sight of her sent a jolt of ice through Mara's veins. Clara McBride. Once, in what felt like another lifetime, Clara had been Mara's only friend in Ash Hollow, the only person who had ever shown her a sliver of kindness. Now, Clara's face was pale and drawn, her eyes hollow and haunted. "You're alive," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth or relief. Mara stiffened, her hand tightening around the handle of the wooden bucket. "Clara, you shouldn't be here." Clara's mouth twisted into a bitter, ugly line. "They're still looking for you, Mara. The sheriff. The whole town council." Mara's heart began to pound a familiar, fearful rhythm. "Why?" "They think you bewitched that Indian," Clara said, her voice rising with a strange, frantic energy. "They're telling everyone you used witchcraft to make him attack Jonah. They're saying you killed Jonah Reeves." "That's a lie," Mara whispered, shaking her head. Jonah had been alive when they left him. Humiliated, but alive. She knew it was a lie. But lies have teeth in small towns. They can chew you up and spit you out. Clara took a step closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, pleading. "I can take you back, Mara. I can help you. You can explain what really happened. They'll listen to me." Mara looked into Clara's eyes and saw the desperation there. But it wasn't desperation for her safety. It was a desperate, selfish need to be the hero, to be on the right side, to be welcomed back into the fold of the town's good graces, even if it meant sacrificing the only person who had ever trusted her. The betrayal was a physical blow. Mara backed away, shaking her head again. "No, I'm not going back." Clara's face crumpled. It was a terrible mask of grief, rage, and betrayal, all tangled together. "You're choosing him over your own people," she spat, the words full of venom. Mara felt the weight of that accusation. The old shame, the old fear. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, the doubt almost pulled her under. Was she wrong? Was she a traitor to everything she had once known? Had she become the monster they all claimed she was? Then Catan appeared at the edge of the trees. He had heard their voices. He said nothing. He just stood there, his presence steady, solid, unwavering. Home. Mara looked at him, standing there like a mountain. Then she looked back at Clara, her former friend, her betrayer. And for the first time in a very, very long time, a real smile touched Mara's lips. It wasn't a smile of mockery or cruelty. It was a smile of pity, a smile of forgiveness. "No, Clara," Mara said softly, her voice clear and strong. "I'm choosing me." She turned her back on Clara, on Ash Hollow, on the past, and walked away. Later that night, as she sat by the fire, Eli asleep in her lap, Catan came and knelt beside her. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. It was a rare, tender gesture that spoke volumes. "You are not broken," he said, his English rough but his meaning perfectly clear. "You are fierce." Mara closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire, the warmth of his words, the warmth of his unshakable faith in her, seep into the cracks of her soul. Maybe the world would always hunt her. Maybe some scars never fully healed. But here, tonight, under the endless silent stars and the wild, open sky, Mara Langley was no longer running. She was standing her ground. And she was not standing alone. But the biggest secret, the one that explained everything, was still buried. And it was about to be dug up. The snow returned one last time, a stubborn, unseasonable storm late in the spring that draped the hills in a fresh blanket of white and cloaked the world in a profound silence. Mara watched it fall from the opening of their lodge, her son Eli bundled warm against her chest, his breathing soft and even against her heart. Outside, Catan was saddling the horses, his movements as careful and methodical as always. Today wasn't just any ride. Today, they were going back to Ash Hollow. They weren't going back to stay. They weren't going back to beg for forgiveness. They were going back because some ghosts needed to be faced head-on. Some stories needed an ending. It was Mara's decision. Not Catan's. Not fears. Hers. She had realized, in the quiet solitude of the mountains, that she would not live the rest of her life hiding from whispers. She would not teach her son that survival meant surrender. She would ride into that town, walk its frozen, muddy streets with her head held high, and look her tormentors in the eye. Even if no one else stood with her, even if the earth itself cracked open and swallowed her whole. When she had told Catan her plan, he had said little. He just watched her face, his dark eyes steady, and she saw respect in them. "I ride with you," was all he said. And that was enough. The road to Ash Hollow was a desolate track, cutting through fields of dead grass and the skeletal, grasping branches of leafless trees. As they approached, the town seemed smaller than Mara remembered, more brittle and pathetic. The same peeling paint on the signs, the same dusty, vacant windows. But now, she saw it for what it truly was. Just wood and stone and fear. Nothing sacred, nothing stronger than her. The townsfolk began to gather as they rode in, a slow trickle at first, then a crowd. Whispers buzzed through the cold air like angry flies. Mara saw Clara McBride in the crowd, clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders, her face pale and rigid, refusing to meet Mara's gaze. And there, on the steps of the general store, stood Sheriff Crowley, his hand resting casually, almost lovingly, on the butt of his revolver. Mara's heart hammered a frantic beat against her ribs, but she kept her hand steady on the reins, her back straight. Beside her, Catan rode tall and proud, his expression unreadable, his presence a silent, powerful challenge to them all. Eli stirred against her chest, blinking up at the unfamiliar faces and the cold, gray sky. They stopped in the very center of town, the spot where the dust was thickest. For a long, brutal moment, no one spoke. The silence was a weapon, heavy and suffocating. Then Crowley stepped forward, his boots crunching in the thin layer of snow. "You've got a hell of a lot of nerve showing your face here, girl," he said, his voice cold and flat. Mara didn't answer him. She simply slid from her saddle, her own boots landing with a soft thud on the ground she had once fled. She faced him, holding Eli in her arms, with Catan a silent mountain at her back. "I'm not here for your forgiveness, Sheriff," she said, and she was shocked to hear her own voice, how clear and strong it was. It carried across the silent street. "I'm not here for your permission." She let her gaze sweep across the crowd, meeting the eyes of the people who had once judged her, pitied her, spat on her name. She saw the blacksmith, the preacher's wife, the ranchers who had sneered at her. "I was never your curse," she said, her voice softening, but losing none of its power. "You were afraid of me, and you were right to be." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This was not the broken, silent woman they had cast out. Crowley's face darkened, his hand tightening on his gun. What the hell is that supposed to mean? And that's when Mara played the card she had come to play. The truth. It means I know what you did, she said, her eyes locked on his. I know you killed my husband. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. You're insane, Crowley spat, but a flicker of panic showed in his eyes. No, Mara said. My husband, Eli, he wasn't just a farmer. He was a prospector, and he found it, didn't he? Right under this miserable town, a vein of gold so rich it would make you all kings. The faces in the crowd turned from her to the sheriff, suspicion dawning. He registered the claim legally, in secret, Mara continued, her voice ringing with conviction. The deed to this entire valley, to all the land your homes are built on. He told me he hid it, and you killed him for it. You thought if you got rid of him and then me, the claim would be forgotten. The land would be yours. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then she delivered the final blow. She looked directly at Crowley. This scar, she said, touching the jagged line on her jaw. This wasn't from some Indian raid. You gave this to me, didn't you, Sheriff? The night you murdered my husband. You held me down and put a knife to my face, trying to make me tell you where he hid the deed. But I didn't know. So you and your council of thieves, you branded me a curse, a jinx, an outcast. Anything to discredit me in case I ever started to remember. You threw me out to die so your secret would die with me. The silence that followed was absolute. The townspeople were staring at Crowley, at the members of the town council who stood beside him, their faces suddenly pale and guilty. The story made a terrible kind of sense. It explained the hatred, the fear, the desperation to be rid of her. She's lying, Crowley roared, his face turning a blotchy red. She's a witch, in league with the devil! He drew his pistol. Seize her! But no one moved. They were looking at him differently now. They were seeing a murderer, not a lawman. It's over, Crowley, Mara said calmly. It's not over till I say it is, he screamed, raising his pistol, aiming it directly at Mara and the baby in her arms. But before he could fire, another sound echoed through the street. A sound that wasn't a whisper or a word. It was the sound of a dozen horses appearing as if from nowhere. On the low ridges surrounding Ash Hollow, figures appeared. Sioux warriors, armed and silent, sitting on their ponies, their faces grim. Catan had not come alone. He had brought witnesses. Checkmate. Crowley froze, his pistol wavering. He was surrounded, not just by warriors, but by the dawning, horrified comprehension on the faces of his own people. His power, built on lies and fear, had just crumbled to dust. And as for the deed, Mara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she reached up and, with a twist, pulled the worn gold wedding band from her finger. She held it up for them all to see. My husband was a clever man. He knew men like you. He always told me our love was the most valuable thing we owned, that it was worth more than all the gold in the world. With her thumbnail, she pried at a tiny, almost invisible seam in the band. It popped open, and inside, tucked into a hollowed-out space, was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper. The deed. It had been with her the entire time. The town of Ash Hollow erupted, not in violence, but in a roar of accusation aimed at the men who had deceived them. Crowley and his cronies were disarmed, their authority stripped away in an instant. The justice they had denied Mara had finally come for them. Days later, under a sky so vast and blue it hurt to look at, Mara stood on the porch of what used to be the sheriff's office. The deed was legally filed. The land, the town, it was all hers. She was, by law, the wealthiest person for 100 miles in any direction. She looked out at the people of Ash Hollow, who were now looking to her for guidance. She could have banished them. She could have taken their homes. She could have become the tyrant they had been. But she didn't. Catan came to stand beside her, Eli held securely in his arms. The boy was toddling now, curious and full of life. "Your name means brave," she whispered into her son's soft hair. "And one day, you'll understand why." Catan touched her shoulder, a simple, gentle gesture of support. They stayed like that for a long moment, 3 hearts, 1 fire, standing in the heart of the town that had tried to destroy them. They hadn't run away to find peace. They had brought it with them. They would rebuild Ash Hollow, not on a foundation of gold, but on a foundation of fairness and courage. There were no wedding bells, no fancy dresses, just a life stitched together from scars and second chances. A life chosen freely, built bravely, and held fiercely in the heart of the wild. She was never a curse. She was the town's reckoning, and she was her own miracle all along. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, and you want to hear more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have a new story coming tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening.